Hi everyone, I am doing a video lecture on the discussion assignments. I've just finished grading the Module 4 and I'll be grading the Module 5 discussion assignments this weekend. And I've been noticing that a lot of people are struggling with the same things. So I wanted to, and even though I provided an example where I did a discussion myself of a one paragraph argument and provided it in an announcement, and I provided handouts on how to conduct literary analysis. People still seem to be struggling with some fundamental aspects of what you want to be doing when doing these one paragraph arguments. And I'll state it again that these type of, even though you're doing literary analysis or you're talking specifically about a literary text, this type of writing is critical because what you're doing ultimately is source integration. So you're making an argument, using a claim to support that argument, and then providing analysis of how that evidence is working to support your claim. So what you're doing for literary analysis is really no different from what you would be doing in any other type of research work where you have to do the same job or same skill sets of here's my claim, here's how I'm supporting it, and then doing that analysis to help persuade your audience. So what I'm going to do is I copied and pasted. I just decided to use the Module 4 discussion assignment. Firstly, because I never talked about these texts, because this is when I was at the Embry-Riddle conference from Module 4. That was, The Gift of the Magi and The Outsider and Story of an Hour, The Yellow Wallpaper, and another one that I can't remember, or The Necklace by Guy de Maupassant. So those were the 5 short stories that I never got to talk about, so I thought this would give me the chance to talk about one of those short stories. In particular, I'm going to be talking about the Yellow Wallpaper. That's one story that I don't think anybody talked about in Module 4, so I'm going to go ahead and talk about it. But I also thought, so I just copied the Module 4 discussion assignment, which doesn't look that different from any of the other discussion assignment criteria. The only thing that changes, for example, is like what are the literary elements that are being or that you need to discuss in that particular discussion. And then, the 1, 2, 3 are the same for every discussion, right? Which essentially says make an argument, add evidence, do analysis, and then the respond to 2 classmates. A lot of people are continuing to forget that in both of your responses to your classmates that you need to provide evidence and in-text citations. So when you don't do that, you're really hurting your grade, because that's the participation part of the rubric. So you need to make sure that you're doing that, and that's an easier part of the responses are, I think, the easiest part of these assignments. So you don't want to be missing out on those easier points. So what I'm going to be doing is talking or using the Yellow Wallpaper as an example of how I would approach the discussion 1 paragraph assignments, and how you might go about writing them. So the major things that people are having issue with, so noticeable issues in these assignments include that execution of a topic sentence, and I've talked about this quite at length in a variety of video lectures, as well as some of the handouts that you've been given, and this is also repeated in some of the writers' workshops that you've been asked to read through in every module. But the topic sentence needs to be one concise sentence that contains your claim or your argument. What people are missing is how the thing you are talking about is or leads to an interpretation of the text. And that's where I highlighted this up here. So make a claim about blank and how it's significant in one of the short stories. So you don't just want to say something like, style is significant in, the gift of the Magi. That's not an argument, and I think, and this is a normal place where people struggle with literature and literary analysis, but it's something that you need to work work on, because it's not easy. So I don't expect it to be easy for anybody. It's not even easy for me when I was, these are all my notes for prepping for this video lecture on the yellow wallpaper. It took me a while to really think about the text and what I wanted to argue and my interpretation of the text. So for example, if I was talking about style in The Gift of the Magi, your first sentence or your topic sentence, and the topic sentence is a mini thesis, it should talk about what specifically the style is that you're referencing in The Gift of the Magi, but then also, more importantly, how does that factor into an interpretation of the text? So we don't just want to talk about style for the sake of talking about style. That's not the purpose of why we talk about, or why we use texts as a place to talk about something. We're analyzing texts to talk about something larger. So, what is the gift of the Magi? What would be an interpretation of that particular text? And how is that supported? How is that interpretation supported by a specific example of the writing style? That's what you need to be aiming for in your arguments and your claims that you have in these one paragraph arguments. That's the most important thing, because that's the argument. The other thing that people are struggling with is the integration of evidence, which again, I've talked about before. And everything I'm talking about in terms of these noticeable issues, they're all very common. But I've been writing, the same comments again and again and again, which is normal, which is why I ended up deciding to do this video lecture, because I just want to provide another example of how you want to approach these one paragraph discussions, because they're the main assignments that you have outside of those essays, and the essays are just long versions of these one paragraph arguments. So as I've stated before earlier on in the term, how you approach these one paragraph arguments are really going to inform how you approach the longer papers, which is why you want to put a lot of thought into how you construct your arguments and then how you develop it with the evidence in your analysis. So the integration of evidence, you want to provide your quotations early on in the paragraphs. There's a lot of people who are leaving their quotations until later in the paragraphs, and that's not helping. So when you leave your quotations or your evidence toward the end of the paragraphs, you're not doing yourself any favor. You need to, after your claim, I would almost immediately, if not in the second sentence, the third sentence, go into here's evidence. So if you leave it, if you leave evidence to the end of the paragraph, you are not giving yourself the space to provide analysis. So what happens then is that equals too much summary. So what you've done instead is, because you're not giving your evidence until, either at the end or toward the end, whatever comes before that is going to be pretty much summary, because you haven't carved out the space for yourself to do the analysis. So that's one thing that you want to be careful of, is that you're putting your evidence in a place that makes sense, which is, here's my claim, here's some evidence that helps support this claim, and now I can do the analysis that works specifically with this evidence. And then I'm talking very explicitly about the evidence in order to say how this evidence supports my claim. And that's the next part of integration that people are struggling with. And that's the orphan and the hit and run quotations. So again, I've talked about both of these things, but an orphan quotation is a quotation. Make sure I get my arrow, sorry. It's a quotation that has no contextual lead-in, written by you, that introduces the quotation. So if you just have blah, 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 period, here's my quotation, end of quotation, that's an orphan quotation. Your reader's kind of like, I don't know why you're giving me this information. You haven't provided any context for it. How am I supposed to make the connections, right? It's your job as the writer to make the connections for the reader. It's not the job of the reader. And then the hit and run quotations. So these orphan quotations can be hit and run quotations. Hit and run quotations aren't necessarily orphan quotations, or aren't all the time. So hit and run quotations are quotations that you've dropped into your writing without addressing it. So this is where you have said writing, 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 quotation, writing, 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 where none of that writing addresses your quotation. And if you have a quotation and then you have your citation, and then you just say, this shows blank, that's not analysis. You have to refer to whatever it is in your quotation very explicitly that tells the reader what it is you're trying to do. Again, and this is considered lazy writing, is because it's, again, the work of the writer, so it's not easy, but it's the writer's job to make it very clear. Here's this quotation, here's exactly what it is from this quotation that is helping to, corroborate, substantiate, exhibit, illustrate, exemplify, whatever active verb this quotation is doing, to do the work of helping support your argument that comes in your first sentence, or needs to come in your first sentence, because it's a topic sentence. So the integration of evidence is, there's definitely some struggling going on there. And some kind of segueing off of the integration of evidence is analysis. So if you're struggling with integrating evidence, you're going to struggle with analysis. And it's a domino effect. If you struggle with effectively making an argument, you're going to struggle with integrating evidence, and you're going to then struggle with analysis. Because if you have no claim, you're lost immediately, both you and your reader. If you have no purpose or, argumentative purpose to your paragraph, your reader is like, I don't know what you're arguing about. What is this evidence supposed to be doing? It's not pointing back to a specific argument. Maybe it's an example of style, but I don't know how. So you're not doing yourself any favors if you're skipping out on any of these steps, because one really leads into the other. You need all of them in order for the entire paragraph to make sense. So, so if you fail to effectively integrate evidence, you are going to struggle with analysis. And if you fail to have an argument, you are not going to be able to do analysis. And that's because if you don't have anything to point back to, if you don't have anything to support, it's kind of like, well, what analysis are you going to do? There's no real meaning to the analysis if you have nothing to point back to. And I've used the example before of the Italian restaurant, right? So if I were to just state, this Italian restaurant has the best food, it's like, okay, that doesn't really mean anything. I mean, you're saying something, but there's no like, why is it the best food? You know, more specifically, right? It's far too vague. So that by the time I would get into analysis, like I would bring in evidence. By the time I would get to analysis, it's like my pointing back to is I would be pointing back to this restaurant has the best food, but because the argument is so vague, there's nothing really substantial to point back to. So notice that all of the noticeable issues in these assignments are all directly, and I didn't do that purposefully, but they are all related to, they are all explicitly connected to the three major criteria in this assignment. And that's the execution of the topic sentence, right, which is making a claim, the integration of evidence, which is evidence, and then the analysis. So that's all three things. Those are the three major parts of this assignment. So, so I'm going to do an example, and I'm hoping that this will also help, in addition to the instruction I've already provided in the past, as well as the examples I've provided and the handouts I've provided, which I expect my students to look at and to consider when, before and while they're doing these assignments. But I chose The Yellow Wallpaper by Charlotte Perkins Gilman, and I'm going to give you a template for a topic sentence, and I want you to use the template. Don't veer from it. It's just, it'll make your life easier, and it'll get you more into the habit of what a topic sentence should look and feel like. So, so what I did is I first decided, what did I want to talk about? So I decided I wanted to talk about tone in The Yellow Wallpaper. And I did these bullet points here are me doing a form of free writing about, so it was basically like why I chose this tone, and then I gave some examples, and then I chose some explicit quotations that I thought would support this. So I'm going to go through this, and then I get to my thesis statement down here, which you'll notice is long, and that's better. You don't want it, you want every word to have to be there, but the thesis statements and topic sentences are doing a lot of rhetorical work. So a lot of times they are longer because of the rhetorical work that they have to carry. So here I said I chose tone as a literary element because I think the changing tone of this short story is reflective of the text's overall commentary on how the male physician's failure to treat women as human when it comes to addressing psychiatric conditions is underscored by Jane's slow descent into madness, right? Jane is our narrator in this story. And then I said, okay, well, why else do I want to talk about tone in The Yellow Wallpaper? Right, so I say here, and here I talk specifically about, well, how does the tone change? So that was one of the first things I set up here. Right, I talked about the changing tone, and it was like, okay, well, what is the changing tone? So I said, okay, the changing tone is, we have this tone where Jane first arrives at the large house with her family, and then the tone changes once she's been held kind of captive in this quote unquote nursery with the yellow wallpaper. There's the bars on the window. There's this absent husband slash physician. And then she has these visions of the creeping woman in the wallpaper. And right, so then I talk about, okay, well, here's how the tone changes. She first really hates the wallpaper, but then as the story goes on, that we get from her writing, that she's eventually arguably calmed by it and believes she cannot live without it, and wants to instead live inside the wallpaper, right? Which this is going into interpretation, which is the most important part of these discussions. I'm not just talking about tone for the sake of talking about tone. I'm saying here the tone here represents her eventual identification as the creeping woman in the wallpaper. And then, I made some more notes down here about how this radical change, whoops, I have style here, it should say tone. Tone helps to emphasize that the rest cure, and she talks about the rest cure in this, and this is also based on Charlotte Perkins Gilman was also given the rest cure by a doctor that she names in the story, and he famously stopped prescribing it after she wrote this story. So it was socially impactful and medically impactful. But the change in tone also emphasizes that the rest cure dictated by male physicians to women offers no benefits as a treatment, as the reader again encounters Jane's descent into creeping madness. And then Jane becomes obsessed with the wallpaper. She's convinced there's a woman in there who tries to escape every night. She tries to help the woman escaping by stripping the wallpaper off the wall. This is still me talking about the changing tone. Whereas in the beginning of the story, she hates the wallpaper. By the end, she has no desire to leave the room with the wallpaper and eventually identifies as the creeping woman in the wallpaper. So that was kind of here's what I want to talk about. I want to talk about tone. And I want to talk about specifically the changing tone, because the changing tone as a literary element helps to support this larger interpretation that I have about the story, that you'll see how I transformed into a thesis statement / topic sentence. So then the next thing I did was I culled quotations that I thought would help support my argument about this. And you notice I give signposts for all of these quotations. So I give context for all of the quotations. So I know, so they're not, none of them, even written in bullet points, are orphan quotations. And I have an idea, after I did this, when I reread the quotations, I would remember, because I provided myself the context, when in the story it comes and in what context, right? So first I provide, and you can see the quotations come in increasing order of the story. So it starts at the earliest and goes to the latest. So I have a quotation about how she describes the wallpaper when she first kind of sees it, right? There's a specific tone about it. There's this kind of exasperation she expresses about the wallpaper, and how she gets angry at it, that the wallpaper, she personifies the wallpaper. It's impertinent, and it has this kind of everlastingness to it. She refers to it as horrid wallpaper, and she's thankful her child does not have to be in the room. And then these last two quotations are from, toward the end of the story, and I even say toward the end of the story, Jane wishes to be alone in the room and locks the door before her and her husband are meant to return home, and she expresses, right, how she wants to get back behind the pattern when it comes night, and that is hard. And then she talks about where earlier in the story she could not tolerate being in the room with the wallpaper. She later, I should say later, not latter, she later proclaims that it is so pleasant to be out in this great room and creep around as I please. So that's a drastic change in tone, where she goes from being positively angry with not just the wallpaper. And if I were turning this into a larger paper, there's a lot more I could talk about in terms of her being angry at the entire room, right? She talks about the bars on the window a lot, and the bed, and there's a lot she talks about in this room. But in the end, she's really happy and she can creep around as I please. Now, if I were talking about diction, which is word choice, I would definitely be talking about the word creep. There's a lot of, she talks a lot about creeping women and how the what feels to be a supernatural being in the throughout the story until the end, when we can interpret that there was never a supernatural being, that in fact she was projecting, psychologically, something onto this wallpaper, that she was seeing a woman who was struggling that was in fact herself, which is the identification with the wallpaper. But you could talk about the word creep if I were using this. I could also talk about the word creep in terms of style, because diction is part of style. But the word creep itself, and I actually looked at the etymology of creep, and always looking at etymology, which etymology is the history of a word, is oftentimes helpful because it can help extend your argument. So, for example, I was like, whoops, up here, we see that in the late 14th century, creeping is referencing a disease or slowly spreading. So arguably, you could talk about how the word creep, or the act of a creeping woman, is a diseased woman, that there's something wrong with this particular person, right? Or creep. This is creeping as an adjective, creep as a verb, right? Secret, or to evade detection, move slowly, feebly, or timorously, right? So this has to do with hiding, or and even talking out loud about it. It gives me more ideas about how I could help support my own thesis, which I will show you now. So this is a thesis or topic sentence, if I were writing this discussion, that I would come up with. And so what it says is, the tone in Charlotte Perkins Gilman's 1892 short story, The Yellow Wallpaper, radically changes across the story from a disgust of to identification with the wallpaper, which reflects Jane's transformation and is significant to the story's suggestion that the occlusion or loss of female identity happens when a woman is viewed as invisible and her autonomy is taken from her. So yes, it's a long sentence, but it has everything that an argumentative sentence needs to. So the first thing that I want you to notice is all of the contextual information that I have here. This is the type of stuff that you want to include, and that includes, and there's a number of ways you can order it, right? But I have the literary element in author, year, that's possessive, medium, in this case it's a short story, title. That's how I would recommend you starting off every single one of your statements, is just giving all of the contextual information. Sometimes people are just giving titles, and that's because not everybody knows. First of all, the audience to whom you're writing is a little bit unclear, I think, because of the nature of the discussion forum. But I want you to treat these paragraphs as you would an essay. So you want to be formal and thus providing all of the contextual information about the text. So then what I go on to do is I talk specifically about the tone. And specifically the thing I wanted to talk about, which is about the changing tone across the story, and I explain here's how it changes. It changes from disgust of to identification with the wallpaper. And then I say, and further, right, that this tone reflects Jane's transformation, and most importantly is how the tone emphasizes, or how this changing tone that I've identified is leading me to a particular interpretation of the story, that the story suggests that, or argues that the occlusion, and to be occluded just means to be hidden, the occlusion or loss of female identity happens when a woman is viewed as invisible and her autonomy is taken from her. And then and that's why I said, if I went back to creep, this right here, where creep, the verb, means to secretly or to evade detection, is really interesting when I think about the thesis that I just crafted, because I could go on, if I were writing a more full-blown essay of this, I would bring in that etymological discussion of the word creep, because that goes on to suggest that she felt so invisible, and her identity was in the process of being erased, that she wanted to be behind the wallpaper, that she wanted to be that creeping woman, or that the creeping woman is an invisible woman. And I can make that argument just by virtue of talking about the meaning of the word creep. So this is what you want to strive for in your topic sentence. And from here, if I were writing, I would almost go directly into the integration of evidence. I've already pulled a multitude of quotations. Some of you are doing a great job, and you're all choosing quotations well. Some of you are putting one quotation in, some of you are putting 2 or 3. So because I would choose to talk about the changing tone, by virtue of that, I need to integrate more than one quotation. And so, there's a way that I could, even though I have 1, 2, 3, 4, 5 different quotations, I could join. I would probably take these 2 to talk about how the tone is depicted early on in the story versus, before her identity is erased, or before she becomes this secret or invisible woman, because the other character, particularly the male characters in the story, or the male character in the story, views her arguably as invisible, and that she doesn't have her own identity, the tone changes because of that. So I might say something like, early in the story, now I'm just writing this. This I took longer to write. This probably took me about 15 to 20 minutes. And that was after I had already done all of this free writing about the story, and really thinking about, well, what exactly am I arguing in terms of tone and my interpretation of the story. So I might say, like, early in the story, the tone, or I might say Jane's tone toward the wallpaper is more hostile than how the reader, or I wouldn't say that, or than how, I just say, doing just a comparison, than her, or even simpler to that, than later in the story. Let's say it's far more hostile. Before, preceding her descent into madness, or I would say loss of identity, again, to support my thesis. And I'm just going to copy and paste. I'm just going to copy and paste this. You can also see how I'm doing MLA as well. And now I've already said wallpaper, so I'm going to get rid of that, but I'm going to keep horrid in there. oops. And then I'm sorry, I'm going to just copy and paste this as well. It's going to make it all a bullet point, which we'll just get rid of. We'll change the verb. Put this all down here. Get rid of the I have this is multiple times. And when analyzing the pattern of the wallpaper, she exclaimed, blah, 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 blah. Now, I have two quotations there from two different pages. I have 471 and 473. In MLA, you can do this. It doesn't all have to be at the very end of the sentence, but I just want to note that horrid comes on page 473 and this other quotation comes on page 471. So that would be an example of how to, of when I would want to integrate quotations, right? So I have this long first sentence, which is my topic sentence. And then I have this kind of transitional sentence where I'm prepping my reader for this evidence that's coming. And then I have the actual evidence there. And then I might say something like, this, Jane views the wallpaper as, I don't know, reprehensible. I'm writing off the cuff now, so it's not going to be great writing. Okay, so in this sentence, I'm working to do the job of analysis. So in the tone here, Jane views the wallpaper as reprehensible, suggesting the wallpaper is an evil entity that is impertinent and everlasting. I'm referring back to something impertinent and everlasting, right? That, and I might even say, right, I might even add that. So all of this here is doing the job of pointing back directly to things that are coming from the quotations, that the wallpaper is impertinent, it's everlasting, blah, 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 blah. And then from there, I would go into, okay, I've already now talked about and provided some analysis of the tone at the beginning of the short story. And from there, I would work on integrating the quotation or quotations. I might, choose one. I might shorten some of those. The quotations themselves are not that long. That one is that long and this one is that long. My signposts are what's making it look longer to provide that context. But then from there, I would go into, this, or Jane's abhorrence toward the wallpaper at the story's beginning greatly differs from her view of it toward the end of the story, when she slowly descends into madness and simultaneously identifies as the creeping woman behind the wallpaper. So before I would get into analysis of that, I would first provide, and I would probably choose this one. So I'm just going to pull that whole bit that I have there. I'm going to take away the, now I have here as an introductory phrase toward the end of the story. I'm just trying to make sure that it's not repetition of anything. And it doesn't, because here I say differs from review of it toward the end of the story when blah, 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 blah. So I can just say something like, near the story's end, Jane wishes to be alone in the room and locks the door before her and her blah, blah, blah. She expresses blah, 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 blah. And then I might say, like, this quotation exemplifies that Jane has ultimately come to lose her female identity and has become invisible depicted in the tone that right, so that's just right, so I provided, in talking about changing tone, I've given, here's an example of what the tone was at the beginning, before she lost her identity, right? She's kind of in a battle in this story of, with her autonomy, with her ability to be an autonomous woman. And she's constantly at war with her husband. And, she always says, what about this? What about that? And he's constantly saying, no, 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 this is what I say. This is what you say, and you have to do it. And she does it. And she eventually gives in, right? And how you interpret her giving in is, up to you. I'm interpreting it here in a specific way, although I could interpret it in a different way as well. So I've talked about, here's how it was, here's the tone in the beginning, here's the tone later, where she wants to be a part of the wallpaper. She wants to kind of join it and hide behind it. And that tone, or that change in tone, is reflective of this larger interpretation of the text itself, of Jane being at war with her own autonomy, and ultimately, arguably, in interpretation, she loses that battle, loses her autonomy, and she becomes the creeping woman behind the wallpaper. So, and then I wouldn't add any more quotations in this particular paragraph. I might just add a little bit more of kind of what I talked about to wrap up the analysis and take it back to my thesis statement / topic sentence. But that's how I would close out this paragraph. But everything here is, notice that there's no summary, because that's another thing that people are struggling with, is giving too much summary. But the only summary I'm providing is in the context that is needed before the quotations come. That's the only summary that happens. So providing contextual information needs to replace summary, and everything else outside of that needs to be analysis. So that is all I'm going to talk about. I just wanted to talk about how these discussion one paragraph arguments are going, provide some cumulative feedback in terms of where I'm seeing some consistent issues, and then do an example that I almost finished, because I would just do a little bit more analysis after that, but do an example of how you want to approach the really important first sentence, and then making sure to emphasize and get people to really thinking about that idea of this, which is how the thing, or how the literary element, or whatever it is you're talking about, is suggestive of a larger interpretation of the text. That's the most important thing. And without that, if I wasn't talking about this kind of loss of identity, or loss of how the text is commenting on the loss of female identity, or the occlusion of female identity, or the occlusion of womanhood. How, without that, this becomes a very myopic argument about style. And that is an argument that is kind of in vain, because it doesn't do anything in terms of what the text. It's reductive because it's failing to consider how the text is socially significant. And if we don't do that, then all of our arguments are in vain. So that's why we need to make sure that when we do literary analysis, that it has connection to larger social issues, and they all do. So that's what I'm going to talk about. If you are continuing to struggle, or you have questions, or you want me to talk more about this, please let me know. But otherwise, I look forward to reading your discussions on Antigone, and I will talk to you guys soon. Okay, bye-bye.